The grand piano in the Allister mansion played a song of sorrow that night, but no living hands touched its keys. When the final haunting note faded, the lady of the house was left screaming, and the slave girl, Clara, was gone. The drawing room, moments before a tomb of silent opulence, was now filled with a lingering, impossible melody that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains and seep into the polished wood of the floor. Mrs. Allister, her face a mask of disbelief and terror, pointed a trembling finger at the gleaming instrument as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. The young woman meant to be polishing it, Clara Williams, had vanished as if into thin air. The only sign of her passage was an open window, its lace curtains billowing softly in the humid Charleston night breeze, beckoning toward the darkness outside. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Earlier that day, the world had been suffocatingly normal. Clara moved as a ghost through the grand halls of the Allister mansion, a silent, efficient presence in a house that demanded perfection but offered no kindness. The air, thick with the oppressive humidity of a South Carolina summer, carried the cloying scent of beeswax and lemon oil, a constant reminder of the endless cycle of cleaning. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the whispery rustle of Mrs. Eleanor Allister's silk dress as she patrolled the corridors, or the sharp, definitive clap of her hands that could summon a servant from 3 rooms away. Clara's world was one of stark contrasts. The gleaming, sun-drenched surfaces of mahogany tables and silver platters against the permanent grime lodged deep beneath her own fingernails, a testament to the labor that made such brilliance possible. She was polishing the family silver in the dining room, her movements practiced and economical. In the convex belly of a soup tureen, her reflection appeared, a fleeting, distorted ghost with wide, watchful eyes and a mouth that never smiled. She saw not herself but a caricature, a warped version of the girl who existed only in service. It was easier that way to see a stranger in the polished surface. It helped her detach, to retreat into the quiet fortress of her own mind, where she was more than just a pair of hands. "More pressure, girl." The voice, a low, cutting drawl laced with impatience, sliced through the quiet. Clara didn't startle. She had heard the whisper of silk on the Aubusson rug moments before. Mrs. Allister stood over her, her thin frame rigid with disapproval. "Do you think this silver shines itself? Your idleness is a sin, an affront to God and to this household." Clara's fingers tightened on the soft cloth. She applied more force, her knuckles aching as she rubbed circles into the metal until it burned with reflected light. She offered no reply, for none was wanted. Her silence was part of her uniform. Mrs. Allister made a small, dissatisfied sound in her throat and swept from the room, her presence lingering like a bad perfume. From the adjoining study, Clara could hear the rustle of a newspaper. Mr. Allister was in his usual place, buried behind the day's headlines, a man so thoroughly lost in his own home that he had become another piece of furniture. He was a passive participant in the household's quiet cruelty, a man whose gaze slid past the servants as if they were invisible, his silence a different, more cowardly kind of oppression. The weight of her enslavement was not a sharp, sudden anger for Clara, but a constant dull ache in her bones, a weariness that sleep could not cure. She found her solace not in dreams of a future she couldn't imagine, but in the melodies of the past. Her grandmother, before she was sold, had filled Clara's childhood with songs, tunes that told stories of rivers and stars and a freedom so distant it felt like a myth. Clara kept these songs locked deep inside her mind, humming them without sound, the vibrations a secret comfort against her ribs. They were her only true possession, a legacy that could not be polished away or inspected for flaws. Her final task of the evening was always the same: to dust and polish the grand piano in the drawing room. The instrument was a monstrous, gleaming beast of dark mahogany and yellowed ivory, its legs carved into the shape of snarling lions' paws. It was the centerpiece of the room, a magnificent symbol of a world Clara could serve but never, ever join. It sat like a shrine, its lid always kept firmly closed. Mrs. Allister claimed the salty sea air of Charleston was bad for the delicate strings, a convenient excuse for the fact that no one in the house knew how to play it. The piano was not an instrument for creating music. It was a declaration of wealth, as silent and for display as the porcelain figurines in the glass-fronted cabinet. Clara ran her cloth gently over the intricate carvings that adorned its sides, her fingers tracing the lines of leaves and vines. She felt the history in the wood, the faint vibrations of a life lived long before the Allisters had purchased the plantation. She often wondered about the hands that had built such a thing, the craftsmen who had bent the wood and strung the wires. She wondered about the music it was meant to create, the symphonies and sonatas that slept within its silent heart. Her grandmother had told her that music was a form of magic, a way to speak to the spirits, to send messages across the veil that separated the living from the dead. Looking at the piano, Clara felt it was both a coffin and a cradle, a thing that was simultaneously dead and brimming with a terrible, sleeping potential. It was a sleeping giant, and she was the mouse tasked with keeping its magnificent cage clean. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving streaks of bruised purple and orange that were quickly swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The drawing room was lit by a single tall oil lamp on a side table, its flame casting long dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes into lurking creatures. The air was still and heavy. Clara was alone, the rhythmic whisk of her feather duster the only sound in the cavernous space. She was finishing her work, her thoughts already turning to the small, stifling pallet that served as her bed in the servants' quarters. Then it happened. A single clear note rang out from the piano. It was not loud, but it was as pure and piercing as a shard of glass cutting through the thick silence with absolute authority. Clara froze, her hand hovering in midair. Her heart gave a violent lurch against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings in a cage. Her eyes darted around the empty room. The windows were latched against the night bugs. The doors were closed. She was utterly, completely alone. Her breath hitched in her throat. It must have been the house settling, the old wood groaning under the strain of its own weight. It had to be. Then a second note joined the first, a perfect, harmonious third above it. It held in the air, shimmering with a resonance that felt impossible. A slow, melancholic melody began to unfold, note by deliberate note, filling the room not with a sound but with a presence. Clara's eyes flew to the keyboard. The keys, gleaming faintly in the lamplight, were moving. They depressed and rose with a graceful, fluid motion pressed by an unseen phantom force. A wave of cold terror washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. But beneath the fear was something else, something she could not name, a profound and chilling awe. The music was achingly beautiful, steeped in a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. This was not the work of a demon, it was not a sound of malice. It felt like a memory, a lament for a loss too great to be borne in silence. The tune was both strange and familiar, a melody she felt she had heard before in a dream, or perhaps it was a half-remembered lullaby from a life she'd never lived. It spoke of heartbreak and longing, of a love torn asunder, of a spirit that refused to be silenced. It was the sound of the piano that drew Mrs. Alastair from her parlor. She appeared in the doorway, her face already pinched with irritation, a sharp word on her lips. But the word never came. She stopped dead, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. She saw the empty room. She heard the phantom music pouring from the grand piano, and she saw the keys moving, dancing under invisible fingers. For a woman whose entire life was built upon control and rigid, unshakable composure, the sight was an utter violation of reality. Her carefully constructed world shattered in an instant. A sound escaped her throat, a piercing, unearthly shriek that was not of anger but of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes, wide with horror, darted from the moving keys and locked onto the only other person in the room. She saw Clara standing frozen beside the instrument, a dark-skinned silhouette against the spectral music. In that moment, Mrs. Alastair's terror found a target. Fear, raw and primal, curdled instantly into a familiar, venomous accusation. "Witch!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "What have you done?" The music stopped as abruptly as it had begun, the final note hanging in the air for a heartbeat before dissolving into the screaming. Mr. Alastair, his face ashen and his evening coat hastily thrown on over his nightshirt, rushed into the drawing room, his eyes wide with alarm. He saw his wife, hysterical, pointing a shaking finger at Clara, who stood like a statue carved from shadow beside the silent piano. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, as if lightning had struck inside the very room. Mrs. Alastair's words were a torrent of panicked fury tumbling over one another. "She has brought the devil into my home," she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. "Voodoo witchcraft. Look at her, she doesn't even deny it. She will be the ruin of us all. A curse upon this house." Clara remained frozen, the accusation washing over her like ice water. Words clogged her throat, bitter and useless. What could she say? That the piano had played by itself? That the music had felt like a prayer, not a curse? In their eyes, in this world, the truth was a far more dangerous lie than any she could invent. To be a slave was to be guilty until proven innocent, and innocence was a luxury she had never been afforded. She saw the path of their logic, twisted and cruel, and knew it led directly to a place of unimaginable pain. Any defense was useless. Her silence was her only shield, however thin. Mr. Alastair, pale and visibly shaken by the impossible sound he had heard from his study, took a hesitant step forward. "Eleanor, calm yourself. There must be a rational explanation." "Rational?" his wife spat, turning her wild eyes on him. "Did you not hear it? Do you not see this This creature standing there with the devil's own smirk on her face? Clara was not smirking. Her face was a blank mask of shock, her mind struggling to catch up to the catastrophe unfolding around her. But Mrs. Allister saw what she wanted to see. Mr. Allister's fragile attempt at reason crumbled under the force of his wife's conviction. He looked from his hysterical wife to the silent, still girl, and his fear chose the path of least resistance. He would not cross Eleanor in this state. "Lock her in the cellar," he commanded, his voice trembling, avoiding Clara's gaze. He directed the words to the butler who had appeared silently in the doorway. "We will deal with this in the morning." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Deal with this. Clara knew what that meant. It meant the slave trader with his cold eyes and colder hands. It meant the auction block, the sting of the whip, a brutal punishment to make an example of her. The butler, a man whose own servitude had hardened him into a tool of the master's will, stepped forward and gripped Clara's arm. The touch was rough, impersonal. As he pulled her from the room, the last thing she saw was Mrs. Allister collapsing into a velvet armchair, sobbing with a mixture of terror and triumphant rage. The cellar door groaned shut behind her, and the heavy bolt slid into place, the sound echoing the closing of a tomb. Clara was plunged into a profound and suffocating darkness. The air was thick and damp, carrying the musty smell of packed earth, rotting potatoes and sour wine. Cold seeped up from the stone floor through the thin soles of her shoes. For a long time she just stood there, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of the phantom melody and Mrs. Allister's screeching accusations. The terror of the cellar, a place of punishment for misbehaving servants, was a familiar childhood fear. Spiders, rats, and the suffocating dark. But tonight it was the least of her worries. As her eyes slowly adjusted, the pitch black softened into shades of deep gray. She could just make out the hulking shapes of barrels and crates stacked against the far wall. The immediate primal fear of the supernatural event began to recede, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of what awaited her at sunrise. They would not believe her. They would beat the truth out of her, and when her truth did not satisfy them, they would beat her for lying. Then they would sell her. The thought sent a tremor of a different kind of fear through her, a fear of the known, of human cruelty in its most intimate and methodical form. But then another memory surfaced, pushing through the terror: the music. It hadn't been evil, it had been sorrowful, a lament so profound it had made the very air ache. It was a song of loss, not of malice. Whatever spirit had moved those keys was not a demon, it was something else, something wounded, and it had, in its own strange way, reached out to her. The fear of the known, of the whip and the auction block, and the suffocating certainty of her fate in the morning began to swell until it was a monstrous thing, far larger and more terrifying than the fear of the unknown wilderness that lay beyond the mansion walls. A spark of defiance, small and fierce, ignited in the cold darkness of her heart. She would not wait for their judgment. She would not let them be the authors of her final chapter. Her mind raced, latching onto a secret she had kept for years. A loose board behind a stack of old apple crates, discovered one afternoon when she was a child, hiding from a visiting overseer with a reputation for cruelty. It led to a narrow, forgotten crawl space that opened out into the overgrown gardens behind the house. It was a child's secret, a tiny pocket of freedom in a world of walls. Now it was her only way out. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. She moved, her bare hands finding the rough, splintered wood of the crates in the dark. They were heavy, filled with discarded junk, but her terror gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. One by one, she dragged them aside, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every scrape and groan of the wood on the stone floor sounding like a thunderclap in the silence. She paused, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. The house above was silent. Finally, she reached the wall, her fingers frantically searching the damp stone and wood paneling until they found it. The slight give of the loose board. Prying it loose was a tense, agonizing process. She used her fingernails, breaking them against the wood, her fingers raw and bleeding. She worked a small, flat stone she found on the floor into the crack, wiggling it back and forth. The scraping sound grating on her nerves. At last, with a low groan of protesting nails, the board came free. She squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough wood tearing at her dress, and into the cool, damp earth of the crawl space. She crawled on her hands and knees, the smell of dirt and worms filling her nostrils until she saw it, a faint patch of lesser darkness ahead. She pushed aside a thick curtain of ivy and tumbled out into the humid night air, a shadow among shadows. Freedom. The air had never tasted so sweet. The sounds of the night, sounds she had barely noticed before, were now magnified into a symphony of escape. The rhythmic chirping of crickets, the distant lonely bark of a dog, the rustle of palmetto leaves in the gentle breeze. She was a ghost in the Alastair's manicured gardens, her bare feet silent on the cool, damp grass. She kept to the shadows of the grand oaks, her body coiled with the fear of being seen. She avoided the wide moonlit drive and the main roads, instead slipping through the dark, narrow alleyways of Charleston that ran behind the great houses. Every snapped twig, every clatter of a loose cobblestone sent a jolt of fear through her. The city watch, the slave patrols, they were a constant, menacing presence. To be caught out after curfew was to be whipped and returned, a failed runaway, a thing of even less value. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, driven by a primal need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the mansion. She reached the edge of the city where the manicured gardens and paved streets gave way to marshland and untamed woods. Before her lay a choice: the known danger of the roads or the terrifying unknown of the cypress swamp. Without hesitation, she plunged into the oppressive darkness of the trees. The change in environment was immediate and absolute. The air grew thick and heavy, clinging to her skin like a wet shroud. It was pungent with the smell of decay, of damp earth and stagnant water. The solid ground of the city dissolved into a soft, sucking mud that pulled at her bare feet with every step. Great cypress trees rose around her like skeletal giants, their branches draped in thick veils of Spanish moss that swayed in the darkness like ghostly shrouds. The familiar sounds of the city were swallowed by the alien noises of the swamp. The deep guttural croak of bullfrogs, the sudden splash of some unseen creature in the black water beside her, the incessant high-pitched buzz of 1,000 insects in her ears. Her fear was immense, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a different kind of fear than the one she had known in the mansion. This was a primal fear, a fear of nature's indifference, of tooth and claw and the vast dark unknown. It was clean, impersonal. With every sucking step she took deeper into the swamp, she felt the invisible chains of the Alastair house, the weight of Mrs. Alastair's gaze and the suffocating politeness of Mr. Alastair's cruelty falling away. They were being replaced by a more immediate and honest challenge, the challenge of pure survival. She stumbled on for what felt like hours, lost and disoriented until exhaustion finally claimed her. The first faint hints of dawn were beginning to filter through the thick canopy, turning the blackness to a hazy, spectral gray. She collapsed at the base of a massive cypress tree whose roots were like gnarled knuckles plunging into the dark water. She was shivering not from the cold but from a bone-deep weariness and the lingering terror of the night. Despair began to creep in, a cold and insidious companion. She was alone, lost, and hunted. She had escaped the cellar only to find herself in a larger, wilder prison. And then she heard it. It was faint, so faint she thought at first it was the wind sighing through the moss-draped branches. But it grew, a clear, haunting melody carried on the morning mist. It was the same song, the same beautiful, sorrowful tune from the piano. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, an echo in the woods, a whisper from the water itself. She froze, listening, her breath held tight in her chest. But this time there was no terror. The music washed over her, and with it came a strange, inexplicable sense of guidance. It was as if the song was a thread pulling her forward. It was no longer the curse that had condemned her, the supernatural horror that had cost her everything. It was something else. It was a compass, a mysterious melodic thread connecting the life she had fled to a future she could not yet see. In that moment, huddled at the base of the ancient tree, Clara realized she wasn't just running from something, she was being led somewhere. A new strength, born of mystery and a nascent sense of purpose, flowed into her weary limbs. She pushed herself to her feet, her eyes scanning the misty woods, and began to walk toward the sound. The music was a ghost, a siren's call leading her deeper into the labyrinthine swamp. Clara pushed through dense undergrowth, thorny vines catching at her torn dress and scratching her arms like angry claws. The phantom melody ebbed and flowed, sometimes seeming to come from just ahead, other times swirling around her as if the trees themselves were singing. Her feet were numb, her body a vessel of pure, aching exhaustion. Hunger was a hollow pain in her stomach, and a feverish heat was beginning to bloom behind her eyes, making the world shimmer and tilt. She followed the sound with a singular, desperate focus, the notes a lifeline in the disorienting wilderness. It was the only thing that made sense, the only guide she had. The song was her North Star, her strange, sorrowful shepherd. She stumbled through a curtain of thick, wet leaves, and her foot caught on a submerged root. She fell forward with a cry that was little more than a gasp, her hand sinking into the cool, soft mud of a small clearing. The world swam, the edges of her vision blurring into a dark tunnel. She had nothing left. Her body had given its last ounce of strength. As her consciousness began to fray, she saw two figures emerge from the dense cypress grove at the far side of the clearing. They moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of belonging to this place. One was a young man, lean and muscular, his eyes sharp and wary as he held a long, handmade spear tipped with fire-hardened wood. His gaze was not welcoming, it was an assessment of a threat. The other was an older woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair bound in a colorful wrap. She carried a woven basket filled with leaves and roots, and she watched Clara with a calm, unreadable expression that was somehow more intimidating than the young man's open hostility. Clara tried to push herself up to speak, but the fever had taken hold. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of green and brown, and she collapsed into the welcoming darkness, the last echo of the phantom melody fading from her ears. She drifted in and out of a fever dream, a confusing tapestry of fragmented images and sounds. She was back in the Allisters' drawing room, the piano keys moving under invisible hands, but the music was now interwoven with the croaking of frogs and the buzz of insects. Then she was in the dark cellar, the smell of damp earth filling her senses, but the cold stone floor felt like the soft, mossy ground of the swamp. A gentle hand, its skin cool and dry, pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. A voice, low and melodic, murmured words she couldn't understand, a unique dialect that flowed like water. The air smelled different here, a mix of wood smoke, unfamiliar herbs, and something savory cooking over a fire. It was a world away from the beeswax and lemon oil of her former prison. When her eyes finally opened and held focus, she found herself lying on a soft pallet of woven grasses and blankets inside a small, sturdy hut. The walls were made of mud and moss packed over a frame of bent saplings, and the roof was a thick thatch of palmetto fronds. Light filtered through the single open doorway, painting a bright rectangle on the packed earth floor. The old woman from the clearing, Maybelle, sat on a low stool beside her, grinding herbs in a small wooden bowl. She looked up, her dark eyes missing nothing. "The fever is broken," she said, her voice as calm and steady as her gaze. "You are safe here." Clara tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. Maybelle placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rest. You have been walking with the spirits for 3 days. The young man, Cato, appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. He still held the spear, and his suspicion had not lessened. "She is awake," he stated, his tone flat. "She comes from the city. She could bring trouble. The patrols could have followed her scent. The hounds would find no trail in the water we crossed," Maybelle replied without looking at him, her attention focused on Clara. "And this one, she did not run here by chance. She was called." Clara's throat was dry, her voice a hoarse whisper. "The music—" Maybelle's eyes flickered with something, a deep and ancient knowing. "In your fever you hummed a song," she said softly. "An old song." Cato scoffed from the doorway. "A fever dream, a trick to gain our trust." "Hush, boy," Maybelle commanded, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that made Cato fall silent. "Some dreams are memories that have lost their way. You will have your questions answered when she is strong enough." Over the next few days, Clara slowly regained her strength, tended to by Maybelle's patient care. She drank bitter herbal teas that cooled the last of the fever and ate a simple, nourishing stew of fish and swamp vegetables. She learned that she was in a hidden village, a sanctuary for escaped slaves built on a patch of high ground deep within the treacherous heart of the cypress swamp. It was a community bound by shared experience and a fierce determination to remain free. They spoke a unique rhythmic dialect she later learned was called Gullah, a language that carried the echoes of Africa within it. There was a sense of purpose in the village, of a life reclaimed, but beneath it all ran a current of deep-seated caution. Every stranger was a potential danger, every unfamiliar sound a possible threat. Cato's suspicion was not his alone. It was the caution of a people who had paid for their freedom with blood and vigilance. When she was finally able to walk without stumbling, Clara was brought before Maybelle and two other community elders. They sat on carved wooden stools around a low, smoky fire in the center of the village. The other villagers gathered at a respectful distance, their faces curious and watchful. This was her trial. She had to explain herself to prove she was not a threat to this fragile sanctuary. Cato stood behind the elders, his arms crossed, his spear leaning against a nearby hut, his eyes boring into her. Clara's heart pounded. She took a deep breath, the smell of wood smoke filling her lungs, and she began to speak. She told them everything. She spoke of the oppressive silence of the Allister mansion, of the gleaming, monstrous piano, and of the night the music had started. She described the beautiful, sorrowful melody, the moving keys, and Mrs. Allister's terrified, accusatory scream. She recounted her escape, her desperate flight into the swamp, and how the same haunting tune had called to her in the darkness, leading her to their clearing. As she spoke, she expected them to look at her with disbelief, to think she was either a liar or mad. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Cato was the first to break it, his voice dripping with scorn. "A piano that plays itself?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "It is a trick, a story to hide the real reason you were running. Perhaps you stole something, perhaps you were followed." An old man beside Maybelle nodded slowly, his face etched with doubt. "It is a strange tale, child. Spirits do not often concern themselves with the white man's instruments." Clara's hope began to wither. They did not believe her. She was an outsider, a storyteller with a tale too fantastic to be true. But Maybelle, who had been watching her with that same intense, unreadable gaze, raised a hand for silence. "Hush, all of you," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of doubt. She turned her eyes, dark and deep as the swamp water, back to Clara. "Some things have long memories. Wood and wire can hold a story just as a mind can. Tell us the tune, child, the tune the piano played." A hush fell over the gathered people. All eyes were on Clara. This was the final test. Her voice trembled as she began, but as the melody took shape, a strange confidence filled her. She closed her eyes, remembering the sound as it had filled the drawing room, a sound of profound and ancient loss. She hummed the tune, clear and precise, her voice carrying the weight of its sorrow across the clearing. She poured into it the fear, the awe, and the mystery of that night. As the last note faded, the silence that followed was different. It was not a silence of doubt, but of stunned recognition. Several of the older villagers murmured, their eyes wide. Cato's cynical expression had vanished, replaced by one of confusion. Maybelle closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a truth she had long suspected. She opened her eyes and looked at Clara, and for the first time Clara saw not just a healer or a leader, but a keeper of secrets. "That is not the white man's music," Maybelle said, her voice resonating with a deep, solemn power that captivated everyone present. "That is our music. It is an old song, a gula spiritual. We call it the Song of Sorrow." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It was composed generations ago right here in these low country lands. It is a lament for those we lost, a song for the husbands and wives torn from each other on the auction block, for the children sold away south, for the mothers who threw themselves from the slave ships rather than face the chain. It is the sound of our pain, the story of our people poured into music so that we would never forget." Clara stared at her, stunned into silence. The blood rushed in her ears. The supernatural event, the terrifying haunting that had shattered her life, was not a random act of a restless spirit. It was a message, a piece of her own history, a history she never knew she had, reaching out to her across time. The music was not a curse, it was a legacy. It was the collective grief of her ancestors, given a voice. Mabelle's gaze softened with a profound empathy. "How that song, our song, came to be trapped inside that piano in that white man's house," she said, her voice now a low, thoughtful murmur. "That is the real mystery." Clara looked around at the faces of the villagers, seeing her own shock and awe reflected in their eyes. The terror that had driven her into the swamp began to transform, alchemizing in the firelight into something new, something powerful. It was a profound sense of connection, of belonging not just to this small, hidden community, but to a long, unbroken line of people who had suffered, survived, and remembered. She was no longer just Clara, the runaway slave girl. She was a daughter of the Gula, a keeper of the Song of Sorrow. She was part of a story far larger and more important than her own. The ghost in the machine was the ghost of her own people, crying out from the belly of the beast. The seasons turned, bleeding the oppressive heat of summer into the cool, damp breath of a Carolina autumn. The swamp, once a place of terrifying shadow, became Clara's home, its intricate waterways as familiar to her as the corridors of the Allister mansion had once been. Months passed, measured not by the chime of a grandfather clock, but by the phases of the moon and the rhythm of the tides. Clara's life was rebuilt, piece by piece, from the rich mud and resilient spirit of the Gula community. The girl who had arrived half dead with fever and fear was gone, replaced by a woman whose strength was etched into her very being. Her hands, once kept soft for polishing silver, were now calloused and nimble, skilled at weaving the long, pliant strands of sweetgrass into sturdy, beautiful baskets, their intricate patterns telling stories older than the city of Charleston itself. Her skin, once pale from a life spent indoors, was now kissed by the sun, a healthy, rich brown. The fear that had lived permanently in her eyes, a constant hunted look, had been replaced by a watchful calm, the quiet confidence of a creature who knows her territory. She learned to fish with a net woven from vines, to read the weather in the rustle of the cypress leaves, and to pole a flat-bottomed skiff through the black water with silent, graceful strokes. The Gula dialect, at first a stream of unintelligible sounds, slowly became her own language, its melodic cadence a comfort, a tangible link to the people who had taken her in. Life was a shared endeavor. They worked together, ate together, and in the evenings gathered around the communal fire, its flames pushing back the immense darkness of the swamp. Here stories were told, histories were passed down, and songs were sung, their voices rising with the wood smoke into the star-dusted sky. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the profound comfort of belonging, of family. She was no longer property, a tool to be used and discarded. She was a person, her existence valued, her hands needed, her voice a welcome part of the chorus. The deep trauma of her past, the years of servitude, and the final terrifying night began to heal, the scars fading into the tapestry of her new life. Yet even as she found peace, the mystery of the music remained, a quiet but persistent hum in the back of her mind. The song had led her to freedom, but its purpose, and the story of the spirit who played it, was a question that still burned within her. One evening, as the fire crackled and the elders shared tales of the old country, Clara felt a surge of courage. She turned to Maybelle, who was watching the flames, her face serene in the flickering light. "Maybelle," Clara began, her voice quiet but clear, drawing the attention of those seated nearby. "You told me the melody was the song of sorrow. You said it was our music, but you never told me its story, the full story." Maybelle turned her gaze from the fire to Clara, her eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. She saw the strength in Clara's posture, the clarity in her eyes. She saw a woman who was no longer running but ready to understand. Maybelle gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Some stories are heavy," the old woman said, her voice a low murmur. "They are not for children or for those whose hearts are not yet strong enough to carry them. But you, child, you have carried the song itself. You are ready to know its name." A hush fell over the small gathering. Maybelle began to speak, and the story of Elias unfolded in the firelight. He was a man who had lived 2 generations ago, enslaved on the very same plantation the Alistairs now owned, long before their name was ever attached to it. Elias, she explained, was a musician of rare and wondrous talent. He had not been taught by any master. His gift was born in him, a piece of the old country that had survived the brutal crossing. He could carve a flute from a simple river reed and play music so beautiful it could make the hardest overseer pause and listen. His music could make people weep with a sorrow they didn't know they held, or dance with a joy that defied their chains. He made that song, Maybelle continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, for his wife, Zillah. She was his heart. They had been together since they were children. One day the master sold her south to a sugar plantation, a place from which no one ever returned. Elias begged, he pleaded, but it was no use. He watched them take her away in a wagon, and a part of him died that day. Maybelle paused, her eyes distant, lost in the memory of the story. He did not speak for a month. He just worked, his face a mask of stone, but then one night the music started. He had poured all of his grief, all of his love, all of his rage and despair into the notes of a new song. It was a message to Zillah, a promise, He told his friend, my grandfather, that as long as his music lived, their love would never truly die, that his spirit would wait for hers, held within the melody. Not long after, the master, fearing the power of such a sorrowful tune, sold Elias too. But his song remained, a spirit on the wind, a memory in the hearts of those who heard it. The story settled over Clara, heavy and profound. Elias, Zillah. Their tragedy gave the song a soul, a name, a history of unbearable loss. The connection she felt was no longer just cultural, it was personal, intimate. She grieved for them, for a love torn apart by the casual cruelty of a master. Weeks later, Cato returned from one of his clandestine trips to the outskirts of Charleston, where he traded woven baskets and gathered information. He moved through the village with a tense energy, his eyes scanning for Clara and Maybelle. He found them near the water's edge, cleaning a recent catch of fish. "There is news," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Gossip from the city." Clara's heart gave a small lurch. She had not thought of the Allisters in months, pushing them into a distant, dark corner of her mind. "The Allister mansion," Cato began, a grim smile touching his lips, "is now infamous. The white folks in the city, they have a new name for it. They call it the Haunted Mansion of Charleston." He recounted the tales he had overheard, stories that had grown wilder with each telling. He spoke of phantom music that echoed through the halls on moonless nights, of objects moving on their own, of a chilling presence that had driven most of the servants to flee. "They say Mrs. Allister has been driven half mad by it all," he continued, his voice laced with satisfaction. "She rarely leaves her room, and when she does, she screams at shadows. They have tried to sell the piano, but no one will buy it. It is a cursed object now." The news was a strange, distant thunderclap for Clara. It was a confirmation that the spirit Elias had not fallen silent after her departure. But it was Cato's next piece of information that struck her with the force of a physical blow. "The man I trade with, his cousin, worked for the family who sold the plantation to the Allisters," Cato said, leaning in closer. "He says the piano was not bought by them. It was not moved into the house. It was part of the estate when they purchased the land. It has been in that drawing room for more than 50 years. The air seemed to rush from Clara's lungs. The piano was there when Elias was there. It wasn't just a random instrument that had somehow learned his song. It was his instrument, or at least an instrument he had touched, had poured his soul into. The connection was no longer theoretical, a spiritual echo across time. It was concrete. It was wood and wire and memory all locked together in that gleaming mahogany box. That night, the three of them sat away from the main fire, the darkness of the swamp enclosing them in a private council. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Clara stared into the shadows, her mind racing, fitting the pieces together. The song, the story of Elias, the piano itself. It was all one story. "His spirit isn't just in the song," she said, the words coming to her with absolute certainty. She looked from Cato's intense face to Maybelle's wise one. "It's in the piano. It's tied to it, trapped. It wasn't just playing a song, it was trying to tell its story, it was calling for help." Maybelle nodded slowly, her expression solemn. "It is as the old ways teach," she affirmed. A spirit can be tied to an object, a place, a memory, especially a spirit with a powerful unfinished purpose. It can be restless, unable to cross over until its story is heard or its task is done. The understanding settled upon them, shifting everything. The haunting was no longer a generalized cry of ancestral pain, but a specific, desperate plea from one of their own. Elias was not just a ghost in a story, he was a member of their family, lost and unmourned, his final message to his wife trapped in the belly of his master's prized possession. The focus shifted from fear to awe, and now to a profound sense of responsibility. They were the keepers of his song, the only ones who knew his name. Clara felt a powerful conviction rise within her, a feeling so strong it was a physical force. The song was not just a lament, it was a map. The piano was not just a prison, it was a treasure chest. She felt an overwhelming certainty that something of Elias's, something physical he had left behind, remained with that piano. A token, a letter, a piece of himself that he had hidden away, waiting for someone to find it. It was the key to his peace. The music had led her out of the house to save her life. Now she realized with a chilling, electrifying clarity it was calling her back to save his soul. The decision once made settled in Clara's heart with the weight of a sacred vow. She stood before Maybelle and the elders, the firelight casting dancing shadows across her resolute face. "I am going back," she announced, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable finality that cut through the evening's calm. A collective murmur of disbelief and shock rippled through the villagers who had gathered nearby. To them it was heresy, a deliberate step back towards the hell they had all escaped. Cato, who had been silently observing from the edge of the firelight, straightened up as if he had been struck, his face a mask of confusion. Maybelle's expression, usually a placid lake of wisdom, tightened with concern. She leaned forward, her gnarled hands gripping her knees, her voice a low, urgent plea. "Child, you do not know what you are saying. To go back to that place is to risk the chain again. It is to walk willingly into the lion's den wearing the scent of the lamb. Freedom once gained is a fragile and precious thing, a gift from the ancestors. It is too precious to gamble on the ghost of a song." Clara met the elder's worried gaze, her own eyes filled not with defiance but with a deep and sorrowful understanding. The love and respect she felt for Maybelle, for this entire community, was a physical ache in her chest, but her conviction was a fire that no warning could quench. "I am not the same girl who ran from that house," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. "That girl was a slave, a piece of property, her world defined by the four walls of her master's house. She was running from a whip and a scream. I stand here tonight as a daughter of this community, as a free woman. My world is this swamp, these people, our history. This is not for me. It is for Elias." She paused, letting the name hang in the smoky air. "His spirit called to me in that dark room. It guided me through the swamp when I was lost and dying. It brought me here to all of you. His song gave me my freedom. I cannot live with that gift, knowing his own spirit is still trapped, his story unheard, his promise to his wife unfulfilled. I must give him his peace." Her words, spoken with such simple, profound certainty, settled over the gathering. They saw not a reckless girl, but a woman on a holy mission. The doubt in their eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning shared sense of duty. This was not about the Allisters. It was about one of their own. Cato pushed himself away from the cypress tree he was leaning against and stepped forward into the circle of light. The last vestiges of his initial suspicion had long since been burned away, reforged by the quiet fire of Clara's resilience into a profound and steadfast respect. He looked at her, at the unshakable purpose in her eyes, and then he looked at Mabel, his decision made. "You will not go alone," he said, his voice a low, firm declaration. It was not a question or an offer, it was a statement of fact, a promise sealed in the presence of their people and their ancestors. The journey back was a tense and surreal inversion of Clara's desperate flight. They became creatures of the night, two shadows slipping through a world that wanted them either in chains or in a grave. The deep swamp, their sanctuary, slowly receded behind them. Its familiar chorus, the deep croak of bullfrogs and the soft hoot of an owl, was gradually replaced by the growing dissonant hum of civilization, a sound that now felt alien and menacing. The air itself seemed to change. The clean, earthy scent of damp soil and living things gave way to the sour stench of coal smoke, of refuse, and a faint, underlying odor of oppression that clung to the outskirts of Charleston. They traveled by the light of the stars, Cato's intimate knowledge of the hidden paths and forgotten waterways their only map. By day they concealed themselves in dense thickets of palmetto or the hollowed-out trunks of ancient cypress trees, sleeping in shifts, one always watching while the other rested, their hands never far from the knife at Cato's belt or the heavy stick Clara now carried. Their senses were stretched taut, every nerve ending alive to the slightest sound. The snap of a twig could be a patrolman's boot. The distant baying of a hound could send ice water sluicing through their veins. One moonless night, hiding in a ditch as a group of riders passed on the road above, their loud laughter and cruel jokes about a recent runaway echoing in the darkness, Clara felt a cold, primal fear grip her so tightly she could not breathe. Cato placed a steadying hand on her arm, his touch a silent anchor in the terrifying dark. For Clara, every step closer to the mansion was a battle against the ghosts of her own memory. The sight of a distant plantation house, its windows lit like malevolent eyes in the dusk, made her stomach clench with a familiar sickening dread. She was willingly walking back into the source of her trauma, and it felt like a violation of her very soul. But the image of Elias, of his song trapped in that cold, silent room, pushed her forward. She was not being dragged back to her past. She was on a mission to reclaim a piece of it. They spent a full day hidden in a grove of trees on a rise overlooking the Alistair estate. The mansion a pale, sickly monument in the distance. From their vantage point they watched the house, learning its new broken rhythm. It was quieter now, a place of decay. Fewer servants moved about the grounds, and those who did moved with a hurried, fearful energy. The once perfect gardens were becoming overgrown, weeds choking the rose bushes. The house itself seemed to be shrinking, consumed by the fear it harbored. Late in the afternoon they watched as a carriage was brought around. Mr. and Mrs. Alistair emerged, dressed in fine evening wear. Mrs. Alistair looked thinner, her movements brittle, her face pale and drawn. They were attending a ball in the city, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade of normalcy. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. As dusk fell, the sky began to bruise, dark clouds rolling in from the sea, carrying the promise of a storm. The wind picked up, rattling the leaves and setting the Spanish moss into a frantic, swaying dance. It was a perfect cover. Under the cloak of the rising storm, they made their move. They slipped through the neglected gardens, the wind whipping at their clothes and masking the sound of their footsteps. They reached the back of the house, the place where Clara had tumbled out into freedom months before. The thick curtain of ivy was still there, and behind it, the narrow opening to the crawl space. It felt like a lifetime ago. Re-entering the tight, dark space was a profound violation. It was the mouth of the prison, and she was crawling back into its gullet. The smell of damp earth and her own fear filled her nostrils. They emerged into the cellar, the darkness absolute, the air thick with the scent of dust and sour wine. The house above was eerily silent, save for the groaning of its timbers in the wind and the first fat drops of rain beginning to lash against the high, narrow windows. They were inside. They crept up the cellar stairs, every creak of the wood a thunderclap in the silence. The main floor of the mansion was cold and still, thick with a fine layer of dust that covered every surface, a testament to the neglect born of fear. The opulent furniture and fine paintings were like relics in a forgotten tomb, their brilliance tarnished. The air was heavy, stagnant with an unspoken dread. They moved like ghosts through the familiar hallways, their bare feet making no sound on the polished floors until they reached the double doors of the drawing room. With a shared, silent glance, Cato slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was a cavern of shadow, the furniture looming like sleeping beasts. In the center of the room, moonlight from the tall windows, now streaked with rain, fell upon a large object covered by a heavy white sheet. It was the piano. It looked like a sarcophagus, a tomb for the music and the spirit trapped within it. The only sound was the drumming of the rain against the glass and the frantic, desperate pounding of their own hearts. Clara felt a strange pull, an energy emanating from the shrouded instrument. She walked towards it, her legs feeling heavy as if she were wading through deep water. Cato remained by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. Clara reached the piano, her hands trembling as she took hold of the corner of the sheet. She pulled it back. The dark mahogany wood was cold and dead to the touch, its polished surface dulled by a film of dust. It was just an object, a box of wood and wire, but she knew better. It was a cage. She ran her hands over its surface, not as a servant tasked with polishing it, but as a seeker, someone searching for a secret. She was not guided by logic, but by a pure, undeniable intuition. A silent hum in her soul that seemed to be in conversation with the spirit of Elias. Her fingers traced the intricate carvings her younger self had so often cleaned, feeling for something that was out of place. Her hand moved down, along the base of the keyboard, over the decorative panels. There. A slight looseness, a barely perceptible give in a small carved wooden panel adorned with a floral design. It was a flaw so minor that no one but a person who had touched it every day for years would ever notice. "Cato," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He was by her side in an instant, With the tip of his knife, he carefully worked the edge of the panel, prying it gently. The old wood groaned in protest, and then with a soft click it came loose. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, a secret compartment carved into the body of the instrument. A wave of dizziness washed over Clara. It was real. Nestled inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were two objects. The first was a small hand-carved wooden bird, its form worn smooth with time and touch. The second was a tight roll of yellowed paper tied with a fragile, faded blue ribbon. With fingers that shook so badly she could barely control them, Clara carefully lifted the roll of paper from its hiding place. The ribbon felt as delicate as a butterfly's wing. She gently untied it, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm against her ribs. She unrolled the paper. It was a sheaf of handwritten sheet music, the notes drawn with a careful, elegant hand. At the bottom of the final page, in a graceful, looping script, was the title Song for Zila, and beneath it, the signature Elias. Tucked within the folded pages of the music was another piece of paper, a letter. Her eyes scanned the words, a heartbreaking farewell from Elias to his lost wife. He wrote of his undying love, of his soul being torn in two, and of how he had poured all that was left of him into this song, a vessel to hold his spirit and his promise to wait for her, for eternity if he must. As Clara held the music in the letter, a profound and overwhelming sense of peace filled her, a feeling of a promise finally kept. The story was finally truly being heard. As Clara's fingers brushed against the fragile, yellowed paper, a profound sense of peace settled over her, a quiet stillness that seemed to push back the raging storm outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. The story was complete. The spirit had a name. The sorrow had a reason. In that moment of pure, unadulterated resolution, as she held the tangible proof of Elias's love and loss, the piano began to play again. She did not startle. She had been expecting it, but this time the music was different. The melody was the same, the familiar haunting tune of the Song for Zila, but it was no longer steeped in the deep, desperate sorrow of a trapped and lonely spirit. The notes that rose from the strings were clear, strong, and resonant, filled with an unmistakable sense of release, of a long-held breath finally let go. It was a song of gratitude. It was a song of farewell. The sorrow was still there, a beautiful foundational ache within the music. But it was now layered with acceptance, with peace, and with a soaring, transcendent joy. It was the sound of a soul finally unburdened, a final, beautiful goodbye to the world that had caused it so much pain. The storm outside seemed to pause, the lashing rain and howling wind momentarily silenced by the power of the melody pouring from the drawing room. A brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a stark, blue-white flash, and in that instant the front door of the mansion was thrown open. Mr. and Mrs. Alastair, soaked from their aborted trip to the city, stood silhouetted in the doorway, their return hastened by the ferocity of the storm. They froze, hearing the impossible music once again, louder and clearer than ever before. Mrs. Alastair let out a choked gasp, her face a mask of pure terror. Her fear, no longer a creeping dread, but a raging inferno, propelled her forward. She ripped herself from her husband's grasp and rushed down the hall, her wet silk gown trailing behind her like a shroud. her mind screaming for a confrontation with the demon that had taken over her home. She burst into the drawing room, her eyes wild, a scream building in her throat, but the sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. The music swelled to a final magnificent crescendo, and then faded into a perfect resonant silence. Bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows stood Clara. She was not cowering. She was not hiding. She stood by the piano, her posture straight and proud, her gaze calm and steady. In her hands she held the ancient yellowed papers and the small carved bird. She looked like a priestess at an altar, a figure of immense and incomprehensible power. Behind her, near the door, the formidable shape of Cato stood as a silent, unmovable guardian. Mrs. Alastair pointed a trembling finger, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "You," she whispered, the word a dry, rasping thing, but the accusation died in her throat. She did not see a slave. She did not see a witch. She saw a truth she could not comprehend, a power she could not command, and it shattered her. Clara did not flinch. She did not look away. She held the gaze of the woman who had owned her, who had terrorized her, and she felt not fear but a vast and quiet pity. She held up the sheet music, the pages trembling slightly in her hand. "His name was Elias," she said, her voice as clear and steady as the final note of the song. This was his song for his wife Zillah. She looked past Mrs. Alastair's horrified face to the gleaming, silent piano. His spirit was not a curse upon your house. It was a story waiting to be heard, a promise waiting to be kept. Mrs. Alastair simply stared, her mind reeling, her entire world of rigid control and absolute dominance crumbling into dust. The ghost in her house was not a demon to be exorcised. It was a man with a name, a history, a love more powerful than her ownership of the very ground she stood on. The truth was a weight she could not bear. She stumbled back, a low, wounded sound escaping her lips, her eyes vacant, her carefully constructed reality completely and irrevocably broken. Clara looked at the shattered woman, then turned to Cato. A silent understanding passed between them. Their work here was done. With a shared nod, they turned their backs on the Alastairs. They did not run. They did not sneak out the way they had come. With a dignity that was its own form of rebellion, they walked with measured, deliberate steps out of the drawing room. They passed the stunned and broken figure of Mrs. Alastair and the pale, useless form of her husband, who could only stare, his mouth agape. They walked down the grand central hallway, their bare feet silent on the marble floors, and they did not stop until they reached the massive, ornate front door. Cato turned the heavy brass handle, and they stepped out into the clean, rain-washed night. The storm was breaking, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon. They walked down the main drive, away from the haunted house and its tormented owners, leaving them to the silence and the ghosts of their own making, and into the promise of the dawn. Their return to the village was a triumph. As they emerged from the swamp, holding the precious artifacts, a cry went up, and the community gathered, their faces a mixture of awe, relief, and reverence. That night they held a ceremony unlike any other. A great bonfire was lit in the central clearing, its flames leaping high into the night sky, casting a warm golden glow on the faces of the people. Maybelle took the sheet music from Clara, her old hands trembling as she touched the paper. her eyes filling with tears as she read the name, Elias. She held the small carved bird in her palm as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. An old man named Joseph, whose grandfather had known Elias and who played a fiddle he had made himself from cypress wood and gut strings, took the sheet music. He studied it for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he lifted the fiddle to his chin, and for the first time in generations the song for Zillah was played as Elias had written it. The pure, clear notes of the fiddle rose into the night, and a sacred hush fell over the community. The melody was clean, stripped of the ghostly echo of the piano and filled with a heartbreaking human beauty. When Joseph finished, a collective sigh went through the crowd. Then Maybelle began to sing. She sang the old words of the Song of Sorrow, but the name felt wrong now. As her voice, cracked with age but filled with power, rose and fell with the melody, others joined in. Soon the entire community was singing, their voices blending into a single powerful chorus that rolled out over the swamp. They were not just singing a song of sorrow anymore. They were singing a song of remembrance, a song of resilience, a song of a love that had survived separation and death. They were singing a song of freedom found, of a spirit brought home. It was no longer the song of sorrow. In that moment it was reborn. It became Elias's anthem. When the final note faded, Maybelle walked to the community's central gathering hut and placed the small carved wooden bird on the rough-hewn mantel above the hearth, a place of honor. It sat there, a tiny silent testament to a love that had moved the veil between worlds and bought a soul its peace. Years passed. The community in the swamp thrived, a hidden sanctuary of freedom and culture that grew stronger with each passing season. Clara, the frightened girl who had run from a ghost, became an elder, her hair streaked with wise gray, her eyes holding the same deep, calm wisdom that had once shone in Maybelle's. She became a keeper of stories, a guardian of their history. The legend of the haunted piano of Charleston lived on among the white residents of the city, of course. It became a popular ghost story, a thrilling tale told to scare children, its true meaning lost, its deep sorrow trivialized into a cheap thrill. The Alistairs had sold the mansion at a great loss and moved away, unable to live with the silence that was now more terrifying than the music had ever been. But deep in the heart of the cypress swamp, the true story lived on. The melody was still heard not as a ghostly, sorrowful echo from a haunted box, but sung with joy and strength around the fire, its notes carried on the voices of a free people. It was passed from one generation to the next, a sacred inheritance. One cool evening, Clara sat with a group of wide-eyed children, the firelight dancing on their faces. She was teaching them the song, her voice now gentle with age, guiding them through the beautiful, bittersweet melody. When the lesson was over, she reached into the pocket of her dress and brought out the small carved bird. She pressed it into the palm of a young girl whose eyes shone with a fierce intelligence that reminded Clara of herself. His name was Elias, Clara whispered, her voice full of love and remembrance. And this is the song of his freedom. The girl closed her small hand around the bird, her eyes wide with a sudden, profound understanding. The story was safe. The legacy would continue.